On November 14, 1832, New York City saw something that nobody in the world had ever seen before. A team of horses pulled a wagon designed to carry up to 15 people, but instead of moving along a road, paved or otherwise, this omnibus moved on rails. The steam locomotive had been invented decades earlier, but it wasn't a practical method of moving people, at least not within a city, at least not yet. It was cumbersome, loud, expensive, and tended to break down. By contrast, horse-drawn carriages were easy, reliable, and relatively cheap. This rail-based omnibus, or streetcar as it quickly became known, combined all the benefits of horse-drawn carriages with the added capacity of moving along low-friction rails. Mass transit as we know it today was born. Even though mass transit was essentially invented in the U.S., we now lag far behind much of the world, despite numerous attempts to increase both intracity and intercity mass transit systems. Now, with climate change looming, the need for more mass transit is taken on a new urgency. But even as plans for new or expanded services are adopted, there's a new threat to mass transit looming, one that, in a few years or decades, could send the whole concept crashing down. Mass transit, its history, the reason we're behind much of the world, and its potential future is the topic for this episode of Progressive Solutions. Before we get into it, a reminder that I want to hear from you. Do you take mass transit now? And if so, what do you think of it? And how would you like to see it improved? And if you don't, what would it take to get you on board? Also, what other ideas and topics would you like to see covered? Put your thoughts in the comments below. And if you like this video, hit that thumbs up button below. Want to see more? Click the subscribe button. Also, ring the bell to be notified as future videos are released. Throughout the 19th century, amazing advances in rail technology brought the first underground rail system to London in 1863, the first cable cars to San Francisco in 1873, and the first all-electric streetcar system to Scranton, Pennsylvania in 1886. By the turn of the 20th century, most streetcar systems were fully electric, and they were everywhere. But costs quickly mounted, and pretty soon streetcar companies found themselves on the ropes. For one thing, streetcar companies had bargained for exclusive right-of-way, making them monopolies in many places. But in exchange, they had to keep fares artificially low, and this inability to raise prices destroyed profits. In those monopoly agreements, streetcar companies also agreed to maintain the pavement around the tracks, and this got very expensive, especially as inflation increased right after World War I. And as if all that weren't bad enough, a new threat to streetcars soon emerged: the automobile. By the late 1920s, cars were a serious alternative, cutting deeply into streetcar revenues. By the Great Depression, many of the streetcar companies were already bankrupt and a lot more were headed there. Then, in the 30s and 40s, there was the great streetcar scandal. GM, Firestone, Standard Oil, Mack Truck, and other companies got together to buy up streetcar companies and shut them down and put their own buses on the streets, and cars too. They ended up paying minor fines for their activities. Meanwhile, subways were coming into vogue. The first subway lines opened in the 1890s in Boston and New York City, and today subway lines and their cousins light rail are in virtually every major city in the U.S. Over 3.5 million Americans take the subway every day outside of New York City. In New York City alone, that number is about 9 million a day. But even the New York City system is only the 6th largest in the world, and the rest of the country doesn't even come close to New York City alone. Local buses are available in many cities, counties, and regional areas, but with rare exceptions, they're generally slow, inadequate, and shunned by almost everyone who can afford a car. As a result, they're generally underfunded and underutilized. For intercity travel, Europe and Asia have a lot more rail service than the U.S. Now, some claim that this is due to the much lower population density here, but Canada, with 1/9 the population and lots of open space, has over 2.5 times as many Via Rail passengers as we have on Amtrak. And it's not because Americans fly a lot more. There are about 8 times as many airline passengers in the U.S. as there are in Canada, but remember, we have 9 times the population, so Americans fly less than Canadians. We make up for this with the average U.S. driver driving about 60% more miles than the average Canadian driver and close to twice as many miles as the average European driver. And this goes to the American love for the automobile. or rather, the myth of the American love for the automobile. Yes, it was originally a myth, created by the auto industry as a response to the American view that cars were dangerous. This myth began gathering steam in the 1920s when the auto industry decided to respond forcefully to the multiple complaints that ordinary people were being run over by wealthy drivers. Some examples of auto industry propaganda include: the auto industry literally invented the term jaywalking. Their first victory was in 1912 in Kansas City with an ordinance that required pedestrians to cross only at crosswalks at street corners. Then in Cincinnati in 1923, 42,000 people signed a petition to require that cars be physically limited to driving no more than 25 miles an hour. Automakers responded by claiming that this would turn the U.S. into China, which was then considered to be the most backward country in the world. They hired pretty women to convince voters, mostly men, to go to the polls and vote against this referendum. And the referendum failed. Auto industry lobbyists then took over a series of meetings held by then Commerce Secretary and later President Herbert Hoover. The result of this was the 1928 adoption of the Model Municipal Traffic Ordinance, which basically made the car supreme and the pedestrian a nuisance. After World War II, the suburbs took off, and so did the need for cars, even if only just to get to work or get to the grocery store. The automobile industry made the most of this, creating the myth that Americans have always loved their cars, and people bought into this myth if only to feel better about their own need for cars. Throughout all of this, automobile industry lobbyists managed to get an entire infrastructure for cars built with tax money. This gave them a huge leg up over mass transit, almost all of which was privately financed. The final blow to intercity mass transit came in 1956 with the passage of the Federal Aid Highway Act that created the interstate highway system. Most of the money for this interstate highway system came from the federal government. A lot of it came from an increased gasoline tax, but quite a bit of it came out of the general fund. This general funding was based on the idea that in the event of a nuclear attack, people would need to travel far and fast, and an interstate highway system would make this possible. Really, the whole thing was sold as a national security necessity. Another advantage that a federally funded highway system had over private rail systems was that the government had the power to force people to sell their homes through eminent domain in order to make room for the new highways, and private rail companies don't have that power. In short, the automobile destroyed most intercity and intracity mass transit in America. And we need more mass transit. In a time of increasing wealth and income gaps, in order to be able to lift yourself out of poverty, you need to get a good job, and most people need mass transit to get those jobs. Fortunately, streetcars and their cousins light rail are making a comeback. In Seattle, Portland, Tucson, Atlanta, Oklahoma City, Milwaukee, Denver, Salt Lake City, Kansas City, Charlotte, Detroit, St. Louis, Fort Lauderdale, they're all building new systems or re-energizing and expanding old ones. And these new or expanded mass transit systems aren't the result of a national effort so much as they're the individual results of individual local efforts to revitalize local business districts and make room for rapidly expanding populations. And as for intercity mass transit, well, as I record this, we're just a couple of weeks away from inaugurating a new president, Joe Biden, who is famous for having ridden Amtrak to and from work for decades. Will he push for new mass transit, and will Congress go along? Trains have a lot of advantages. They can be located in downtown stations rather than airports that have to be located way out of town. Trains use a lot less fuel than airplanes, and for shorter trips, say 200 miles or less, it's probably faster going door to door on a train than in an airplane. It's also a lot less expensive. Can we replace short-haul plane trips with trains? And if so, will all those extra trains convince people to get out of their cars and get on the train? The immediate future of mass transit looks great, but as I mentioned early in this video, there's a new threat looming that could destroy or at least seriously cripple mass transit for good. That new threat is the self-driving car. Right now, in early 2021, self-driving cars they're not available yet. Just 5 years ago, GM, Toyota, Honda, and Waymo, which is owned by Google, announced that they would have self-driving cars on the road by 2020. Tesla was even more ambitious, setting 2018 as their planned release date. It hasn't happened, and we don't know how much longer it'll take, but some cars on the road right now are adding more autonomous features all the time. The Tesla Model S, for example, can pretty much do highway driving by itself. Once they do become available, self-driving cars will be far too expensive for most people even to consider buying, and that's typical. New technologies are always too expensive at first, but the price will come down and a lot more people will want to buy them. And once they do become affordable, we may not even be able to imagine some of the disruptions they'll cause in our society. Not just for mass transit, but for a whole lot of other activities. Here's a partial list just off the top of my head. School buses won't be necessary, as kids can just get in a self-driving minicar, let's call it a pod, to get to school. They can even schedule the car for pickup when they're finished with school or with after-school activities. A lot of shopping trips won't be necessary. Order online, then send your car to pick up what you ordered. Who needs traffic lights and street lights? Self-driving cars will communicate with each other as they near intersections to determine which one gets right-of-way. Look for new laws governing this activity. Emergency vehicles can get to their destinations a lot faster as self-driving cars are programmed to get out of the way. And those emergency vehicles won't need sirens. Those self-driving cars won't need a lot of the current safety devices. They'll be programmed to avoid accidents. They'll be much lighter and require far less energy to get around. And the big one, car ownership could go the way of the dodo and the dinosaur. Uber is currently pushing hard to get their own self-driving cars on the road, and even if they don't succeed, someone is probably going to be able to create a system that'll make renting a self-driving car a lot less expensive than owning one. In addition, they'll be able to provide the kind of vehicle that you need, saving money if you don't need something huge. And say goodbye to the two-car garage. At most, homes might have a single receiving room for the car that comes in to pick them up or drop them off. Who needs mass transit when the self-driving car can get you where you want to go more easily and possibly less expensively? As the automobile crushed the first wave of mass transit, the self-driving car could crush the new wave. But even if this is the future, that future won't happen for, well, several decades at least, and we need to get around now. So while mass transit might be doomed in the distant future, we can and should plan for new mass transit for the foreseeable future that's right in front of us. And who knows, perhaps we have time to wean America off its manufactured love affair with cars. One of the downsides to this love affair with self-driving cars is that you don't get to operate and control this big machine. Take that experience away and people just might not care about owning a car. Okay, now it's your turn. What mass transit options would you want to invest in? And what would it take to get you in a self-driving car? And what would it take for you to decide to choose mass transit over a self-driving car? Leave your thoughts and comments below. And if you have a topic you'd like to see covered, let me know. Thanks for watching. Stay progressive.